The ride continued toward the mouth of the port, past the shipping cranes and the gray fleet of tugboats. He drove smoothly, legally, and with a patience I remember now as unnatural. He navigated the lane where trucks unload, leaning forward with the same unblinking stare, precise hands, a small bruise on one knuckle that might have been from the gear shift. When we pulled up to the drop-off, he killed the engine and turned to me for the first time. His eyes, up close, seemed both wet and utterly dry. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and then reached for my luggage with a slow, practiced motion. He did not say, "Have a good cruise," or "Enjoy the trip." He did not ask where I was going on board. He handed me the receipt, and for the first and only time, his jaw shifted like someone making a decision. He said, "You'll be all right," in a voice without inflection. Then he reached into the glove compartment, handed me the card reader, and slid a $40 fare across to me for the tip, as if he were completing an old script, and shut the door. The words had no weight then. They settled as a small oddity, and I moved away from them as you move away from a dark puddle on a sunny sidewalk. I turned and saw the gangway ahead of me, the dock workers speaking in clipped phrases to each other, the smell of fryer oil mixing with the salt air. I remember the way the sun laid itself on the chrome of the Solstice Star's lifeboats. I remember promising myself to ask at the information desk about shuttles for the return, half to distract from the scene in the car, half to make a plan. I did not think Hector's stare would later thread itself through the rest of the trip like a seam. Stay with this until the end. There's more to unpack than the opening image. If this story resonates, subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss the follow-ups. This one is difficult to retell, and I'll share sources and the small procedural details I gathered from crew interviews. If you're here for the oddities and the dread, I promise to keep it factual and restrained. The first 3 days on the Solstice Star were what cruise marketing promises. The band on the sunset deck playing a cover of a song you almost know. The breakfast buffet at 7:45, where the line for omelets moved like a river. The late-night comedians scraping jokes about seasickness off the liner walls. I kept a small notebook in my carry-on, where I wrote times, because I had the habit of recording things now. The notebook would later become a kind of tether to reality. I wrote down the show times, the names of the crew I liked, Victor from security, whose badge read Victor R., Claire from medical, with a small gold cross tattooed behind her left ear that I saw when she ducked into a cabin's doorway, and the hours when the ship seemed to breathe easiest. I wrote in a thin hand, Cabin 8237, rain at 2:20, after we had a midnight thunderstorm that splashed the balcony. On the afternoon of the third day, the ship was moving slow along a stretch of open water, the engines humming like a distant throat. I remember the smell of chlorine from the pool and the way afternoon light slanted over the foredeck, making white lounge chairs glow. There was a couple who had become familiar to me in the dining room. They ate quietly, not touching the shrimp at the buffet, but always taking a piece of the lemon tarts. The woman, Christy, had a laugh that sounded small and surprised, like someone who had not believed joy could stay. Her husband, whom I will call David because those names feel like the ones they used at dinner, laughed too loudly. They had sat across from me the night before, and their voices were measured, the husband's hand reaching to settle the woman's elbow as if he were testing the skin's tune. I did not know them, I only knew the sound of them and how they moved. The event fell into a pattern I have seen more than once since, ordinary to rupture in the space of heartbeats. At 2:14, I woke to the sound of a thud through the thin wall of 8237. It was too close to be a dream. The hall outside my cabin was a bruise of dim emergency lighting. The ship's clocks read 2:18 when I saw the housekeeper Luis sprinting past, towel over his shoulder, eyes wide in a way that mirrored the driver's stare I could not forget. He moved without stopping, down the hall to the midship bank of cabins, where voices were gathering like a swarm. "Medical to Deck 8, midship cabin 8237, someone called over a handheld at 2:19. The words were clipped and formal. Later, in interviews, that phrase would loop in my head. The corridor smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and something metallic that my brain tagged as adrenaline. I followed reflexively, because when something happens on a ship, you look, and when you look, you are complicit in what comes next. The door to 8237 stood open a hair's breadth. A hallway lamp swung gently on its hinge. Behind him, a man stood in the doorway as if rooted, a creased shirt, his face gray under the emergency light. Behind him, a bed, a white pillow stained softly, the red on white image that I would not let go of. A smudge across the breast, not grotesque, but exacting in its disruption. Someone had already called it. We have a possible fatality. The medical team, 5 in number, moved with a mechanical, practiced calm. Claire appeared, a small figure in blue scrubs, and she spoke into a palm radio, low and steady. Victor from security stood a step behind, his hand on his belt as if holding himself in place. They worked quickly, methodically. A crew member pulled a curtain across the entry to give privacy. Another placed a folding stool and a clipboard. The medics checked for vitals, following a protocol I had seen in the manuals the crew kept under the desk. They palpated, they listened, they checked pupils, pressure, pulse. On the third night after the death, I woke at 1:43 to the slamming of a door across the hall. A child cried somewhere, long and plaintive. I found myself thinking of Hector, the driver, and that fixed surgical stare, the practical movements, the odd goodbye. The idea lodged in me and then became a rhythm. Unblinking eyes watching, the inability to see a person fully. The investigators interviewed passengers in shifts. They took statements with notepads and iPads, sometimes politely apologetic for the disturbance, sometimes blunt about what they needed. Comings and goings in the early hours, noises, any argument heard. They asked for permission to review CCTV footage. The ship's cameras covered traffic lanes and stairwells, but not the inside of cabins. Regulations and privacy would not permit it. Still, the investigators found grainy images of a figure in the hallway at 02:05. A dark coat turning toward the stairwell, then the figure walking away. The footage was low resolution. The face could not be made out. Rumor filled the blanks. Someone said they saw a man with a tattoo on his wrist. Someone else swore a passenger in a red jacket had argued with a woman in the dining room earlier. It was easier, always, to build a suspect out of rumor than to sit with uncertainty. The victim's name, I will call her Christie because that was the name her dining table used, became a presence in the ship's small social fabric. People left folded napkins and small bouquets at the stairwell, as if leaving signs of human warmth could counter the neat clinical procedure of death. The crew moved with practiced tenderness.
The housekeepers wrapped an extra blanket around the headrest of the chair in the common area, as if that would make the light less bright, more forgiving. Claire, the nurse, began to clear spaces with a soft hand, and she told me once, when I found her at a sink washing a towel, that the job piled sorrow on top of duty until the edges blurred. There was one fragment that never left me: the husband at the scene. In the small hours when the corridor had been pulled closed and the med team sent the body forward to morgue storage, I saw him sitting on the edge of the bed outside the cabin, hands rubbing at his face, cheekbones tight. He was not in custody then. He sat hollowly, as if drained of narrative. And his shirt had a ring of dark on the sleeve that someone later said was his own. The security officer present, Victor, kept his distance. Victor had the kind of professional calm that is a learned armor. He whispered to a colleague, then left. By the time we reached the next port for the formal transfer to local authorities, the small city of passengers had rearranged itself into a pattern of suspicion and avoidance. Some people cancelled shore excursions. Others chaired tables in the main dining room as if proximity to others reassured them. When the local press began circulating a single frame from the ship's boarding camera, a shadowed man moving in the corridor, I held that image up to the driver's face in my memory and tried to reconcile them. The shadow on the grainy footage was not a fixed stare. It was only a posture. It could have been anyone. Weeks later, when the ship returned to Miami on its next rotation, the Solstice Star's itinerary included a public statement from the company. They would cooperate with authorities, support the victim's family, and review protocols. The statement had the correct language of contrition and formality. A change to crew training on de-escalation was announced for the following season. The company sent an email to passengers who had been on that sailing offering counseling resources and a small refund. The letter's bland corporate empathy felt like a membrane separating system from human rawness. My own aftershocks were less procedural and more private. I found myself waking at odd times, listening to the HVAC in my apartment and imagining the ship's engines like a distant lullaby. Small sounds triggered larger images. Once, a late-night television commercial with high-contrast flares made me catch my breath. I stopped taking ride shares for months. I began to notice faces in public as if scanning for shuttered lids. In a theater, a man 2 rows ahead of me seemed to have a fixed gaze, and I moved seats. These are the petty, humiliating measures of someone relearning how to be in public after proximity to sudden violence. They are also the honest ones. There is one loose thread that we never tied. Some passengers became certain they had seen the same man disembark at the dock who had driven me from the airport. They sent photos among themselves, messages like private detective notes. I filed the photos because surviving a rupture means you gather data, because you hope to map the thing to the man who made it. In one of the low-resolution images someone sent me, a man with a gray jacket and a close-cut beard seems to stand under the shade of a truck, his posture neutral. At a glance, maybe he could have been Hector. When I compared it to the app photo on my phone, there were superficial matches in height and hairline. But the eyes were not visible in the headlines or the blurred dock photos. You begin to see, after a while, how often you will grasp at pattern and how often the world offers only grain. Months have a way of smoothing the edges of the events until the residuals are the only contours left. I now flinch at a sudden thump in a wall. I cannot watch a band resume their set at a portside festival without thinking of the time the ship's band picked up a tune and the passengers sang along like an offering. I think of the white-on-red image that first hit me in that doorway.
Red on white is a color that will never again be merely decorative.
I think of the people who made the routine of a ship their career, men and women who spent months aboard, with a dependence on the machinery and the code of the vessel binding them to each other. I think about how people in uniform stepped forward, how Claire's hand brushed mine once, and how Victor maintained the border between curiosity and dignity. I think about Luis, who scrubbed and folded towels for a living and then found a life's fragility shoved into his route. I also think, often and with a complicated shame, of Hector and the way his eyes did not close on that bright afternoon. He exists in my memory as the hinge between two otherwise ordinary worlds. He seemed not to belong to the scene he was driving through. His gesture of handing me a tip and a machine to swipe it felt like a small act performed by habit by someone who was conducting himself along a script. I never contacted the rideshare company then. I have since, in fits and starts, tried to find his record in my email, the booking confirmation, a faint trail that might anchor a man to a name. Somewhere in the bureaucracy, he is a small notation on a ledger. Maybe he was tired. Maybe he had a medical condition that made his blink rate low. Maybe he had been awake for too long. The mind prefers tidy explanations. The truth is often less satisfactory. If there is a lesson here, it is not profound. It is only that public spaces are fragile. The Solstice Star was a beautiful, well-run microcosm with its choreography of staff and guest. It carried a death as if it were a bulky piece of machinery that had to be rerouted and cataloged. People continue to get on and off ships and to ride in cars to get to them. We accept the risk of mechanical failure and human failure because the alternative is not living. And yet, living requires a small attention to the way other people look at you and at each other. Do they keep their gaze soft? Do they offer a blink? Small things betray weather beneath skin. We keep an eye out because an eye is often the first sign of something amiss. There were practical things that followed. The company offered counseling. I took 2 sessions with a counselor who specialized in trauma exposure. I told him about the unblinking driver, and he asked me what that image had come to mean. I said that at first it was only a quirk, and then it had become proof that the world could be different inside. He did not offer platitudes. He helped me narrow the anxiety with exposure tasks, sit on a bench at the bus station, notice faces, name features without judgment. It worked in small increments. I still flinch, but less. When the criminal case finally reached a preliminary hearing, the public record was careful and legal in its prose. The husband pleaded not guilty. There were DNA tests and toxicology reports discussed in hushed tones. Lawyers filed motions. I read them like you would read recipes.
For most of us who were passengers, the system's forward motion was its own form of comfort. If law moved, meaning settled into brackets. But the heart of the thing, the immediate human rupture, remained a private gash. I took one more cruise the following year. I told myself it was a test. I booked a different line, a cheaper cabin, made the 5-hour drive instead of taking an Uber. My hands shook a little when I lifted the bag into the trunk. I walked past the same patterns, cocktail menus, towel animals, staff with practiced smiles. At night, the band played and the passengers clapped, and I felt the old fear and a new, sturdier confidence unwind together. On the second night, a man in a gray jacket stood ahead of me in the lines for coffee, and he did not stare like a film prop. His gaze blinked normally. He looked at the barista, at his watch, and he muttered an apology when he honked too loud the next morning. The sunlight on the lifeboats was the same. The sea did what the sea always does. It held and it blurred. So I keep my receipts and my notebooks. I keep dates. I tell the story because I promised myself that if something happens that jolts the pattern of ordinary life, I will name it and give it shape. The title of this piece might make you look for a sinister punchline: the driver as villain, a man without a soul. It is not that simple. Sometimes the terrifying thing is not the bulletproof explanation or the single guilty face. Sometimes it is the quiet face of a world that continues to run, of people who do not always meet our eyes with the softness we expect, of a system that rearranges sorrow into procedure and moves on. There is one image I carry often now: a small pair of eyelids slowly lowering and then rising, an unfussy human act. It is a mundane gesture that we perform on autopilot. I think of it as an ordinary mercy. When I watch someone blink, I watch a small human mercy happen. I look for it in strangers, because looking for mercy is a practice, a way to orient toward the fact that despite the unpredictability of life, we have small acts that keep us tethered. If you were affected by this story, if it brings up anything for you, please seek help. If you traveled on that sailing and need to know more about resources, the cruise line provided counseling and a point of contact. I can share what I was given if you reach out. And if you found this account worthwhile, please subscribe to the channel and share this responsibly. There are stories that demand attention not because they are spectacular, but because they are ordinary humans encountering the accidental and the cruel. Thank you for staying with this one. For me, it was necessary to name it aloud. After I posted the account, there was an unexpected softening in my inbox. People wrote not to demand answers, but to say thank you for naming a thing they had felt but couldn't name.
A woman who had worked in hospitality on cruise ships sent a long note about how crew learn to carry themselves so others will not worry. A retired nurse wrote about the small rituals she kept in hospitals to stay present. A man who had been on board with his teenage daughter simply wrote, "We kept looking for blinking too." The letters were not news stories. They were small constellations of ordinary lives finding one another by shared attention. Some messages were practical. A few passengers asked whether there was a list of counselors who specialized in trauma from public incidents. The cruise line's continuing hotline was still active, and I passed on the information I had been given. Others wanted to talk about the courtroom, about what it felt like to see a system parse grief. A woman from the Midwest wrote to say she had sat through the preliminary hearing streamed on a legal site late at night and had woken her husband and said, "This is us. This is the way the world looks now." She added, "We are learning to blink at each other." A surprising number of notes were confessions, small acts of kindness people had held back because they feared being intrusive. A man admitted to me that he avoided asking other passengers if they were okay because he feared saying the wrong thing. A young woman wrote that she had stood at the railing and not known whether to say anything to the person sobbing nearby, so she had simply filled 2 paper cups with tea and handed one over. Those confessions felt like a low, steady chorus, people fumbling toward mercy. I began, at the invitation of a local community center, to speak in public spaces about what the passage of ordinary mercy looked like in the aftermath of sudden harm. I did not set myself up as an expert. I said, "I am someone who lived through this. I saw how attention can both wound and repair. Here is what I learned." I encouraged people to practice small gestures, to notice faces, to let eyes soften, to offer the brief contact of a hand when appropriate. The sessions were mostly small, often attended by people who had never been on a cruise, but who had experienced their own rupture, a bad diagnosis, an accident, a betrayal.
We would sit in a circle, and at first everyone spoke in generalities. Then the sentences tightened, and people began to tell precise stories of being stared at, of being missed, of how fragile it felt to be looked through. There is an awkwardness to these practices. Mercy, performed in a way that is too earnest, can feel like intrusion. Performed too hesitantly, it becomes invisible. We worked with that boundary. We rehearsed simple phrases. "Are you all right?" delivered with a pause and a steady breathing. "May I sit here?" offered as permission rather than assumption. We practiced listening without trying to fix. People learned to spot the difference between the gaze that demanded explanation and the gaze that offered presence.
Lia de estilo e instruções para síntese de fala. Início das instruções. Você é um narrador/palestrante com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era explanation and the gaze that offered presence. Você está no meio de uma frase ou pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. The legal proceedings continued in the background like machinery. Motions became hearings, became filings. There were moments when watching the court calendar felt necessary, as if paper could translate grief into something accountable, and moments when the calendar's ticking felt like a betrayal. Time was not, in these sorts of injuries, a simple healer. The system could assign guilt, could fine or imprison. It could not, in any durable way, even the loss. For many of us, that truth was neither news nor surprise. It was consolation and limit both. At one of the public sessions, a man arrived who said very little. Afterward, he stayed to speak to me quietly. He had been a passenger in a different part of the ship, he said, and had seen people leave the ship later in the day, flattened by the knowledge that there was no perfect answer. He told me that his mother had died 5 years ago on a hospice ward, and that the small mercies his family had offered each other in the weeks before her death, a cup of tea at night, the way one sister would spoon-feed her when she could no longer hold a cup, had taught him how human attention mattered. "Your blinking image," he said, "it broke something open for me." He left a folded piece of paper with the address of the hospice and a line of thanks. I keep the paper in my wallet. Not all contact was consoling. There were social media threads that treated the story as something sensational, and comments that suggested the only meaningful action was a demand for punishment. People wrote in to say I had been naive to speak of mercy. Others counseled silence, urging that attention given to sorrow only prolongs it. These voices were a reminder that public grief is porous. Some of its oxygen will always be controversy. Still, the private notes outnumbered the barbs. The barbs were loud but few. Most people, when given the chance, prefer to be gently honest rather than performative. I learned the value of rituals small and repeatable. On certain mornings, I would make a deliberate practice of watching the street from my kitchen window, not to find trauma, but to look for ordinariness. A delivery driver who folded his hands briefly at the corner, a pair of teenagers who paused to share a joke and blinked in tandem, an elderly woman who fed pigeons and nodded at the passerby who smiled. These were not theatrical moments. They were the quiet, repeating mechanisms of a world that had not been arranged in response to my fear. They were the stitches in a vast, discouragingly imperfect fabric. I kept a list, not a ledger of people's suffering, but a small catalogue of deeds that made the day bearable.
Lids put back on jars, chairs pulled in behind someone, the soft way a barista placed a coffee at the counter. There were nights when the face of the unblinking driver returned to the room like a bad soundtrack.
The therapist had taught me exposure in measured doses. A bench at a bus station, the quiet naming of features, the practice of reorienting myself to a crowd without the urgency to scan for threat. When the intrusive image came, I learned to sit with it and say, "Here is the image, and here is the rest of the world." This phrasing felt clumsy at first. Later, it became almost liturgical. It was not a denial of the original shock, but a way to place the shock within a larger geography. One spring, the ship's company announced a quiet memorial for the passengers and crew affected by the incident. They invited families, not only those with losses, but also those who had been traumatized. The memorial was held in the ship's aft lounge at sunset. The deck slid into a hue of orange, and the sea was a texture of slow motion. The organizers were careful. There were counselors available, a chance to speak or to pass, a set of candles that could be lit and left in a bowl of water. The event was not televised. It was close and low-staffed, an attempt to hold rather than display. I went because there are rites that make suffering legible. There is a human tendency to want to close a wound with ritual. Sometimes ritual works as a seam. People stood in a loose ring. Some read poems. Some offered thanks that the ocean could be beautiful and ruin at once. A woman I had met in the counselors' group lit a candle and said simply, "We keep going." A crew member who had been there the day of the incident spoke about how trauma travels not only through passengers, but through those whose job it is to attend and serve. He said, "We all have to keep an eye on the next person." Afterward, strangers clustered as strangers do, finding short lines into longer conversation. A man from the Midwest told me about the way his 14-year-old daughter had taken to watching people blink, and then announcing, in delight, every time she saw it. "Blink," she would call, and the family would laugh. That laughter was not at the expense of sorrow. It was a tiny human correction, a refusal to let the world be flattened into a single register of fear. In the months that followed, I found myself returning to the bench at the bus station more often. My exposure exercises grew less like drills and more like a kind of pilgrimage. I would sit for a predetermined length of time, unhurried, and make a rote list of faces: the man with a newspaper, the woman with a stroller, the teenager with earbuds. I practiced naming features without ownership: short hair, blue sweater. And when someone passed close enough to share a breath of the same air, I would allow myself to acknowledge them with a minor nod, a small human calibration. On one of those afternoons, an older man sat beside me and said, without preamble, "You doin' the watchin' thing?" I nodded. He handed me a pack of mints and said, "Helps me when I get tight." He blinked normally, generously, as if to demonstrate.